Hello YouTube. I thought this time I would share a project I've been working on for a little while. This is a Kodak Tourist. This was the last fold-out bellows camera that Kodak produced, and it was in its day quite a good camera. It takes, well, originally it took 620 film. 620, as most of you probably know, is a thing of the past, although it can be found in a couple of specialty film websites. However, it's pretty expensive, and I'm not sure exactly worth it. So I thought I would share my conversion of the 620 camera to 120 film. The first thing with these, and I'll show you when it is unaltered. The reason that 120 and 620 aren't really compatible is right here. Let me make sure that's, well, let's get some lighter background. Now this here is a roll of 120 film. This here is a 620 spool. And by looking at the end, you can see that the 120 spool has a much larger opening and slots than the 620 does. Also, the 120 has a slightly larger spool end. The length is almost the same, but not quite. The 120 on that is also a tad longer. I'm not exactly sure how much longer. It's about the thickness of the plastic end, longer than the steel one. And because of those differences, 120 film really doesn't work especially well in many cameras built for 620. I've got a couple that it works, but it really doesn't work especially well. But I wanted to use, or I want to use, my Tourist because it's such a great camera and it's in a really nice condition. Here's the next difference. If you look inside, you'll see cast, I'm not sure what you would call them. I would call them bosses. They're protrusions in the aluminum casting that stick out in several areas. They also have some sticking up places on the bottom and on the top. And all of those combined create an environment which is really not okay for a 120 spool. It just doesn't fit in there right. It hits top and bottom. They hit, the 120 spools hit these protrusions all the way around. So the film won't spin freely, at least in this camera. And, which one? The take-up, well, the rewind spool has a very small tab on it to grab a very small hole in a different sized spool. So it's a small shank with very small wings on it. So what I have done over a period of time is I've taken my Dremel tool, and I hope you can see that. I have ground down the protrusions, these top, bottom, not so much the top on this side, and only a little bit on the top on the rewind spool, but I've cleared out the ones that are against the back, or actually be the inside of the front, and the bottom. I've worn those down. the ultimate goal is to put, oh, and also these studs here, all of them, this one, this, and especially that one and this one, are small, so that when you put in the 120 roll, they rattle around, and they just don't fit right. So I've taken the Dremel tool, I've ground out those bosses. There's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that I've ground out. And the next step of this was I found a piece of brass tubing, and I don't exactly know, maybe I'll tell you right now. The studs that the film spool has to ride on are 0.150 thousandths. And you really need them to fit in there, which this does pretty well. The outside of this brass tubing is 188, which is just about the right size to fit in. It's a little loose, but not bad. The cool thing about this particular size brass tubing is that it fits right over those factory studs, so that would help tighten up the spacing in the spool so it doesn't rattle, even if it could rattle, which it can't until you grind out those bosses. So I've got, I don't have them handy, but I've got three of these cut to the right size. This is not to the right size, it's too long, about 2.5 times too long, but I've got 3 of them cut. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to super glue them right over the studs on these 2 and this one up here, which is really tiny. And I'm also modifying the rewind spool, or the rewind stud. I don't know what I did with the original parts. However, the original would have a much smaller version of this little winged tab. Well, this is right out of the camera. This goes right here, and this is the part that would fit down into the film spool, so that you can successfully grab it and turn it. Now this is the original washer. That goes on like that. And what I did to make this thing, which fits in here like that, and that makes that big enough and sturdy enough to turn a somewhat larger spool of film. Now what I did with this, I used the original stud, I used the original washer, because the washer has dimples in it that fit down into little grooves. Okay, so having run out of memory, I had to start over. In any event, what I did was I took that little part, which is out of focus right now, and once you have it in your hand, you'll see that the end of it has a slit in it, and that little tab is into that slit, and it's been crimped together. To replace it, you're going to pry open that slit just a little bit so you can get this tab out. And what I did, well, I clipped off a little piece of a hacksaw blade, a piece about that big, and I hand filed it into the basic shape, which is kind of like a squatty T, and I put it back into that slit, kind of crimped it, and then super glued it into place to form a new winder and put it back in the camera. It's there now, that's why I don't have it in my hand right now. That was all I did. Didn't take terribly long, and I got it on, I think, the second try. So this is the camera that I've actually been working on. I'm not going to take it out. You saw it in the first video. It's in there now. It's bigger than the original. It's about twice the size, so it'll fit into the larger opening on a roll of 120 film. Did that. I put it back together, which goes up through the hole in the body of the camera. So I got a screw in the top, and it's still bound up. So what I did from that point was, because I didn't know what was binding, then I started looking at other things. I knew it was binding on the winder side. So opening like this puts this edge on the winder side. I saw this, and I'm assuming that just keeps the spool from shucking up and down. It's the only purpose I can see for it. I drilled out those two rivets and actually took this piece off. Tip, you don't have to. This is not the problem. But if you should think that that's not, or that's causing the bind, it probably isn't. Long story short, what I found was that on the end, the two corners, this is the locking edge, and this is the light sealing edge. You can see a little piece of cord glued in there. These two edges were hitting on the spool. So we'll go back to the done camera, and I don't know if you can see. Okay, we're back, hinging from the other side, so we're on the spool side here. Right in these two corners, we're dragging on that slightly larger 120 spool. So all I did was I took a pair of needle nose and I tweaked in those two corners just a little bit, and that took care of the problem. Now I've got it so it'll wind the way it should. Close it up. And it winds. Doesn't drag. It does okay. So that is the long and the short of that. The grinding, the modifications to the winding spool, and the two bends to that tab, and now that 120 roll and its film fit in there good. One thing I will go into now on this one, the body was good. The lens had fungus in it, so I wound up swapping lenses. There it is. Now, if you should have to take this thing apart, be forewarned. It is a Pandora's box, or can be. First thing, in order to get that ring off, if your camera is so equipped, this little sticking out tab, which is actually a stop, if you can see that, it hits on a pin that's sticking out. And then you turn this around, and it makes your focus. Anyhow, that little tab right there, that unscrews. I thought it was pressed in, so I pulled it out forcibly, and I got it to go back in, but it's not the same. So I wound up swapping out lenses. I'm not going to go into right now, unless somebody really wants it, disassembling one of these lenses. They're a strangely made lens, and I really wasn't happy taking it apart. It's not impossible. I got the lenses clean. I got it all cleaned up and put back together. It just wasn't real convenient. If you're going to go into it, and you're going to need to unscrew this, you need to unscrew that pin, count your turns, and know exactly where it separates, and make a note of that, because you're going to have to put it back in exactly the same spot and then get it to thread on in exactly the same way, the exact number of turns, to keep your focus straight. That's about all I'm going to go into with that right now. But I think that covers everything I wanted to cover on converting, my conversion, not the only way, just my way, conversion for the Kodak Tourist 1 from a 620 roll to a 120 roll. So, that being said and done, until next time.